Sarah, if you want, you can go ahead and share the title screen. Guess it's about that time. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Healing in the Face of Disaster, Communities Coming Together to Save Cultural Heritage. We're happy to have you here. We'll go over a few introductory items, and then we'll get to it. I'm Christina Kane. I'm the Anthropology Collections Manager at the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History. I am also on the Cultural and Historic Resources Task Force, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. And I am the QAM Emergency Preparedness Chair. I'm joined today by Karen Lloyd D'Onofrio, who's at the YMCA of the Rockies in Estes Park and Winter Park. Bethany Williams, who is at History Colorado, is also on the Task Force for Cultural and Historic Resources and is the QAM Professional Development Chair. And Sarah Sachs, who's with the City of Grizzly Museums, is on the Cultural and Historic Resources Task Force and is the QAM Services Lead. So thank you all for participating in this session. I think it's going to be great. A little housekeeping. We do have some polls for you all to take, and you can take those at any time. It's under the polls tab on your right. And please ask any questions that you might have in the Q&A. Feel free to chat along with in the chat, and we will be monitoring the Q&A and either insert those questions as we go or save them for the end. So today I'm going to do a little introduction on our 2020 fire season in Colorado to kind of set the stage for the main part of our presentation, which will be covered by Karen about her case study and her experience with working in our networks to save collections in her institutions. Bethany will then cover a lot of the tools that we have available for you all to help in emergency planning and networking to ensure that if the time comes when you need help, you have some of the tools at hand to do that. And Sarah is going to go into more in-depth about actual emergency plans. So with that, we will get started. Sarah, next slide. So as a lot of you probably know, in 2020, we really faced a lot of obstacles. It wasn't just COVID and civil rights and all kinds of very difficult issues for everyone. But then we found that we were on fire in a lot of places. And from this map, you can tell this is a map from October of 2020 that shows the active incidents at that time. And we've got one up there in Wyoming as well that was producing smoke in Colorado and, of course, in Wyoming. And so I'm going to give a brief little overview of the major fires that were occurring and those that impacted specifically Karen's institutions. Next slide. So we started with the Pine Gulch fire, and these do go in order of time. So you'll note that there's a block of fires that happened at the end of July and in August, and then again in October, November. The Pine Gulch fire at the time was the largest fire in Colorado history. It blew up quite large. It was lucky for everyone that the fire was mostly on public land and was not did not impact a lot of structures. After the end of the fire season, it became officially the third largest wildfire in Colorado history. And that's a little foreshadowing that number one and number two are still to come. As you can see, it burned 139,000 acres. Next. Here are just a couple of photos of what that fire looked like. Again, no major interactions with structures that I'm aware of. but it did produce some really photogenic incidents there. Go ahead and go to the next. And Grizzly Creek Fire then started along I-70. The yellow line in the middle of that map is I-70 through Glenwood Canyon. Undoubtedly, you all heard about this as it closed the highway for a very long time. This started in August and was a smaller fire, but very high impact because of the fact that it was around and surrounding that highway and did jump the highway. Go to the next slide. And the major impact for that, and the damage that occurred was actually power lines, but also its impact on our famous Hanging Lake site, which miraculously survived this fire, even though the fire was 100% around the lake. That area has survived. And so the ultimate destruction from this fire was mostly trees. And we'll talk later about the impact that fires like this have on what's coming next, which may be flooding, because there's now no longer that plant material to absorb water and to prevent flooding and mudslides. So we're hoping that Hanging Lake will hang in there for us another season. Next. The Cameron Peak Fire started in August, and it became the largest wildfire in Colorado history. It surpassed Pine Gulch. At 913,000 acres were burned. This is one of the first fires that really started to get very scary and got into a lot of structures. As you can see from the slide, the fire destroyed 461 structures. The majority, I think at least half of those, or if not the majority, were residences. Not all of them were primary residences, but a lot of residences. And as we will talk about a little bit more, some of our cultural properties were impacted here as well. Next slide. One of those properties was the CSU, Colorado State University Extension Campus. We were unaware that CSU had a campus there, and that they actually have historic buildings and a museum on that campus. CSU itself, the museum folks in Fort Collins, were unaware that there was a museum there. So one of the things that networking really does is they could have had more resources available to them, people who were trained in historic preservation, to be able to respond to this, had their own sort of mother campus known that they existed. So that was one of our networking things through CHR that we did to connect those folks and to get them resources that they needed. As you can see, they're protecting the buildings here. And the only damage they ended up having was some asphalt on those historic buildings. But it's very important to build these networks in advance so that people even know that you exist in the first place is a really important thing. Next. And this is an example of there was a historic barn that was destroyed up in that area, before and after photo of the remnants of that barn. So we will see a couple more of these types of things as we go along. Next. One of the major impacts of this fire was the Shambhala Mountain Center. And unfortunately, they did lose, I think it was 17 structures on their campus. And luckily, the Great Stupa there, as you can see, did survive. This is both during and then after the fire, but they were heavily impacted by the fire. Next. The Williams Fork Fire, it looks quite small on this map, and comparatively speaking, it was quite small, but it was still scary and did impact a lot of our institutions that are up in the Winter Park area. And we'll talk more about those in a little bit. But this was a much smaller fire. But if you think about Cameron Peak is up here and Williams Fork is over here, so we're starting to see some surrounding happening of some of our communities up in the mountains. Next. And those are some pictures of that fire. Next. Then we had the East Troublesome fire starting October 14th. And this fire ultimately became the second largest wildfire in Colorado history. It is adjacent to, across from, the Cameron Peak fire and is a little east of Williams Fork. And this fire ultimately consumed 112 acres, and destroyed or damaged 580 structures. 2 people were killed during this fire. They refused to leave their home. This fire surrounded the town of Grand Lake and was quite frightening for a while to see if what the impacts would be in that town. And was finally contained in November. Contained basically means that the fire line is going to hold. It does not mean the fire is out. So as of April 6th, there were still isolated pockets of heat existing within this fire zone. Next. And during this fire, it did impact the Grand Lake Cemetery, which is a historic cemetery. There wasn't a lot of destruction, but some gravestones were impacted by fallen trees. And in one case, a grave was disturbed. But this, and this is kind of one of those areas when you are a historic property, where do you fall? This is on national park land, but the city maintains it, but there isn't a direct funding source for this cemetery. So trying to determine how to recover from something like this upfront, knowing who your revenue streams are, is really, really critical. Next. And here's an example of, there was actually a movie set up in that area that was destroyed. This is not a historic cabin. It was built for this movie, but it was destroyed during this fire. Next. The Cal Wood fire then started shortly thereafter. So while a lot of us were responding to those big fires, we looked out our window, as you'll see in the next slide. It was literally out my window to find that our own communities were now being threatened. This was a small fire comparatively, but this is right adjacent to or surrounding a lot of towns, and this became the biggest wildfire in Boulder County history. At the same time, the left-hand fire started just the next day. And while that fire was contained pretty quickly and stayed in non-residential area, it was very close again to some small mountain towns in that area. Next. And those are the pictures from Boulder and from where I am in Lafayette. Next. So these museums and cultural institutions were impacted by these fires. This does not mean that they sustained damage necessarily, but these are the institutions that either had to evacuate, had to prepare, were contacted by the Cultural and Historic Resources Task Force to see if they needed help, or did sustain some damage. And so you can see there are a lot of museums, a lot of folks to contact that may not have been prepared for something like this, especially when you were in the middle of potentially up to 3 fires surrounding you. Next. And then this is a list of the known damages. So as you can see, Rocky Mountain National Park and Shambhala Mountain Center really took the brunt of the damage. On the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park, a lot of historic structures and non-historic structures were damaged or lost, including the Western Entrance Station is completely gone, and several historic barns. Karen will tell you more about the YMCA in a minute, and that's going to be the bulk of our conversation. And then the CSU Extension Campus did have those that one cabin and then some replica and interpretive material that were lost. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Karen. And again, please add your questions in the Q&A as we go, and we will make sure that we get to those. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, my name is Karen Lloyd D'Onofrio, and I'm the Association Historian and the Director of Museum and Archives for the YMCA of the Rockies Association. Based out of Estes Park, but we also have collections over in the Winter Park area. So we're going to talk about those a little bit more. Next slide. Okay, so just like a brief introduction, this is kind of what we're going to go over, talking about climate change and cultural and historical resource management. What do we save? Some of the decisions that we need to make. What are some of those community decisions we need to make? So what value do we give to our memories and places? And then finally, being comfortable with our decisions of what we do decide to save within our collections. So climate change has impacted places in very different and challenging ways. Storms, fires, and droughts caused by changes in temperatures, precipitation, and wind speeds are becoming increasingly common for communities everywhere. For example, the recent increase in tornadoes in the southern states of the United States has been linked to the southward migration of the jet stream. And unfortunately, only this week, collections in Cape Town, South Africa have been lost due to a wildfire. So from a historical perspective, and as others have pointed out, climate change or extreme weather patterns or events impact our sense of place. We lose structures, as we've just heard from Christy. Our landscapes change and people move. They have to move, which causes a sense of loss or feelings of nostalgia and displacement, both physically and mentally. But we are an adaptable species, and history has shown that we can adapt to change, and so we must now. But as keepers and preservers of culture and biodiversity, we must also address how climate change is impacting our ability to safeguard our collections, museum and archives. While my case study focuses on the effect of the recent wildfires in Colorado, I think it behooves us all to think deeper about what other impacts climate change might have on our collections. And this includes the influx of refugee species like flora and fauna. And here I'm also thinking about things like pests and mold. And at another place that I worked at, one of the things that we had to think about was the increase of lichen growth on petroglyphs or some of the archaeological structures. So there's real impact going on with climate change to our collections, both internally and externally. So there are new threats to our collections, and I think that when we work on our emergency and our disaster plans, we begin to consider the effects of climate change in our risk assessments. So I think we should go beyond the 10 agents of deterioration, where we focus mainly on internal agents, and start thinking more about the external forces, such as floods and fire. Agents that really are out of our control but can cause immense damage to our cultural heritage. Also, climate change forces us to think about difficult decisions. They make us think about what gets saved and who decides what gets saved. If we lose voices, memories, and places, the record of human history becomes fragmented. So how do we as communities come together to make decisions? How can we ensure that all cultures and histories are preserved? And I know these are big questions, but I think they also give us something to think about when we start considering saving our own cultural and historical resources. So with that introduction and those big ideas and big questions out there, I'm going to switch to our case study of the YMCA of the Rockies. Slide, please. So YMCA of the Rockies has 2 locations. This is the first one at Estes Park. It was established in 1909 on the site of a former tourist resort, and it borders the waterways of Wind River and Glacier Creek. Today, we also share borders with the Rocky Mountain National Park. And many of our historic buildings date from the 1910s to the 1920s. And one building, Mountainside Lodge, which is up there on the right-hand side, is on the National Register of Historic Places and was built in 1920. The Dorsey Museum, which is the image to the left, lacks a fire suppression system. It's surrounded by old growth trees, as you can see in that image there. And it also is a historical wooden structure. Collections primarily record the institutional history of the YMCA of the Rockies, including the cultural and social history of staff, guests, and the immediate surroundings. And we also have an extensive and important photograph collection, paper archives, and artwork representing mid-20th century Western landscape artists, as well as an alumni collection of staff photograph albums and scrapbook collections. Next slide, please. So here is a map. These are a little bit closer, sort of of where we're located. And on that right-hand side, I've put like a little circle of that's exactly where Estes Park and where we are located. And here you can see the East Troublesome fire sort of in the Rocky Mountain Park, having jumped the Continental Divide. And you can see that one little nub of fire that's just above that yellow circle. And that's actually in Moraine Park. And that distance is about half a mile. So that's how close we were to the East Troublesome fire within the Thompson zone. And then the image on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, sorry, shows where Cameron Peak fire came into the park, as well as the East Troublesome fire. Slide, please. So our other property is located out at Granby, and this is called Snow Mountain Ranch. This property was opened in 1969 and sits on 5,000 acres of forest and meadowland. As you can see there, lots of meadows, lots of trees, aspen groves. Historically, the land use for this area was logging and ranching. Today, we have an active forestry management plan in place to manage thousands of acres of forest, which includes aspen, lodgepole pine, and other firs. And then we also have an 1880s cabin from the original ranch on the site, and also the 100-year-old cabin and homestead of the Rowley homestead, which is pictured up there in the left. The small institutional archives for Snow Mountain Ranch and CCO, which is our residential camp, is housed at Snow Mountain Ranch, and they're located in the bottom of a building called Promise Building, which is a modern building, has an active fire suppression system, and has defensible spaces around it, the property. Access to that property is by key card only, and there's also easy access for removal of collections in emergency. Next slide, please. So again, just sort of giving you a location of where we are in relation to those fires. The middle photograph there has a circle around it, and there's a little piece just jutting up, and that's basically where we were. And then the Williams Fork fire is below that. Okay, next slide, please. So this is kind of a brief overview of our timeline of events. The William Forks fire erupted on the 14th of August, and I was actually at the homestead in Granby that day and took this photograph. And this photograph actually is the photograph of it erupting. It was frightening to see, I'm not going to lie, because we are out in the middle of nowhere where that homestead is, and we are surrounded, as you can see, by trees and forests. The second photograph is of the Cameron Peak fire on the 16th of August from Estes Park Center. So by this time, the Cameron Peak fire had entered into the Rocky Mountain National Park, and it was, we had lots of sort of air pollutants, smoke and flames going on around us, and we're also breathing the air pollutants that was being produced by the acres of forest that was burning. And at one point, it seemed like we were surrounded by fires. It didn't matter where we looked. There was, evidence of fires going on. We also had the East Troublesome fire that began on the 14th of October, and that expanded dramatically over the next few days. And then the 21st and 22nd of October, Grant County and Larimer County were affected in very impactful ways. Next slide, please. So that Saturday, from that image that I showed earlier, just a minute ago, Christy contacted me. She sent me an email and said, hey, is everything going okay? Do you need any help? And at that particular time, I was like, well, I'm starting to get a bit worried. And so we sent out an email on the listserv, which Sarah picked up. And she was the contact for the Northern Colorado Museums. And so she reached out and offered some help with evacuation if needed, to lend some hands, and then also offered some temporary storage for us. And in addition, Alison Laird from Pacific Coast Conservation in Denver also contacted me, offering help and space for the Snow Mountain Ranch archive collection. So following Thursday, on the 22nd of October, we had a mandatory evacuation of Estes Park and a pre-evacuation notice for Granby. And those are sort of photographs there that you can see, that picture of the city market at Granby and the East Troublesome fire burning beyond it. And Snow Mountain Ranch is probably about 2 miles away from that one. And then that image of Estes Park, this is in the daytime, is just overwhelming to think about. Slide, please. So sort of stepping back a little bit, we had COVID, right, at the beginning of the year. And we were closed. We had to think about, we had time on our hands, literally. And I think, like many of us, I suspect that we took that opportunity to think about updating some of our procedures, including our emergency plan and risk assessment. For those of us that, lost our museum staff, that was hard to deal with too. But we had to, think about that, the wellness of our own mental health. And so I really did keep myself busy, thinking about our policies and procedures. One of the things that was important to note, that I'd been with the organization for about 2 years. And over those 2 years, I'd really focused on our collections protocols and our procedures, and doing a full inventory. But the emergency plan had taken a back seat. And so the pandemic seemed like a good time to move that up the list. And so I pulled out my West Pass training program from 2008 and started working through the pocket plan, which Sarah will go through with you later. And then after that, I did a quick overview of the 10 agents of deterioration, and I set about thinking about what my collections and the storage areas might look like. So at some time in the past, a previous director had placed orange evacuation stickers on boxes, which turned out to be a double-edged sword. The stickers were easily seen, which is great. They were easily identifiable, but everything seemed to have a sticker on it. And because the collections hadn't really been managed in the past, or at least over the past several years, I should say, I didn't really know what was in the boxes. So I just had to take faith that whoever had put the orange stickers on the boxes knew what they were doing, and we called that done. But also, in addition to the boxes that had been identified, I also identified other collections and records that needed to be evacuated. And here I'm really thinking about the card catalog records that we had. Not everything was in the database. And so I couldn't rely on my database records. So the records, card catalog records, would be important documentation of what we held in our collections for insurance purposes if we had to make a claim. And I also included the artwork and the staff alumni collection of photographs and scrapbooks. Then I went about thinking about, so I'd identified my collections. The next part of that is identifying the risks. or the potential threats. And so I, did the usual 10 agents of deterioration, thinking about physical forces, fire, water, custodial neglect, pollutants, all the usual things. And then I had to kind of do an evaluation of each threat and what I was going to do to mitigate those threats. How was I going to implement the plan? Well, the association had already set out some levels for implementation of emergency plans. And so I pretty much used those that were already in place. So for the association, level 1, it's kind of turned around. So level 1 is the minimal one for here, whereas you think about category 1 or type 1 for threats as being the most catastrophic. So it's back to front on this one. But level 1 was really being in direct evaluation mode. That means gathering information, communicating that information to key staff. But at this point, there really is no threat to safety or to life, to the staff. Level 2 is like, well, we think there's a possibility of an evacuation. Things are getting a little scary out there, but the threat of life to life safety is still not high. But we'll start getting people and putting them into place and setting up an incident command center. And then level 3 is a full evacuation of the property. So for the museum plan that I developed, level 1 to me meant preparing the materials for potential evacuation. That means boxing up, moving to central location for ease of evacuation, maybe updating the database if I have time, and definitely making a list of materials moved into that central location. Identify those new locations with staff and our security officer, and make sure our museum vehicles are full of gas, or at least 3/4 full of gas. The level 2 in my plan was the evacuation of the materials after discussion with the incident command, identify the location where they were going to be removed to, and then contact that host if needed to let them know we're on our way. And then level 3 was evacuation of staff, unlocking doors to all our historic cabins and museums and archives, so that fire crew can get easy access to it. And then also removing our external hard drives and our accession book. So once this plan was written and everything and everyone was identified, we put the plan into the practice stage and ran through different scenarios. And I can't emphasize the need for practicing run-throughs enough. It pretty much saved us, at least. Everybody knew their place and what they needed to do. So slide, please. So as the fires continued into October, and the Cameron Peak fire was now at the northern edge of the Rocky Mountain National Park and moving towards the outlying area of Estes Park, I could actually see the flames from my home in Berthoud. I was beginning to think more about the triggers for implementation of my plan. And so I made the decision to be proactive, and I implemented the beginnings of the evacuation plan at level 1. So I made sure the museum vehicle was full of gas, because if the power goes out or gets turned off, you can't pump gas. And I also put the keys in on the front passenger seat. We also began to consolidate our collections. We moved them into fewer collections and fewer locations. And we also left the storage rooms unlocked, as I mentioned, just in case security needed to get in during the night. I will mention at this point that our collections, other than the artwork, do not have a high value, and our security is done all in-house. I had requested that our security officer do a walkthrough with me, and he came over, and he knew exactly where the firefighters and other staff left on grounds could concentrate their efforts for removal of the collections and protections of different areas if needed. Because the two centers are located across the Continental Divide from each other, so I have one on the east side and one on the west side, each center in my Plan A is the other relocation site. So, and that's for staff and museum collections too. So my Plan A was to move the museum collections over to Snow Mountain Ranch in case if indeed the Cameron Peak fire came in, much closer. And also, the other way. So if Snow Mountain Ranch was being heavily impacted by the Williams Fork fire, or maybe the East Troublesome fire, then we could bring that collection over to Estes Park. But the East Troublesome fire jumped the divide. And that was something that we had never imagined. And I think historically, that's maybe has happened only once when a fire has jumped the divide, but it's a very, very rare occurrence. So this meant I had two sites that were potentially under evacuation notice. And so I had to move to Plan B and move to the host location, and that was Grizzly. This was at a level 3, total evacuation. This was staff that were living on grounds as well as the museum collections. And in reality, we never got to level 2. We jumped straight from level 1 to level 3. That's how fast the fire was moving. So fortunately, I had some reliable staff members from another department over at Snow Mountain Ranch, and they were able to access the collections and load it into two vans. We video chatted all the time, and I walked them through what was needed. And the vehicles were then parked up in the pre-evacuation zone on site and keys left on the front seat. And then they were also charged with making sure that those vehicles got off site if we had to move to a full evacuation over at Snow Mountain Ranch. I will emphasize that these staff did not live in the pre-evacuation zone and their homes were not in danger. But they were staying on site to help out those that had to evacuate. So I had some challenges that quickly became very evident. Staff were being evacuated from their homes. Roads were being clogged with vehicles leaving. And a lot of the seasonal staff that we had on property had left due to health issues arising from the smoke pollution. So at the time, we had very little available staff to help evacuate museum collections. And certainly no full-time museum staff because unfortunately I'd had to lay those off due to COVID. I did have 2 museum volunteers who were living on site, Colleen Couch and Sydney McCain. And we also press ganged a lifeguard at the pool to drive the museum vehicle full of museum artifacts to the evacuation point in Loveland, where my museum volunteers were able to pick it up and drive it to Grizzly. Slide, please. So we were allowed back on site on the 28th of October. We were allowed on site for 4 hours maximum. The sheriff was notified that we would be coming up the Big Thompson River Canyon, and names were given and shared to him and to his staff. And so we were let through the roadblock at the beginning of the canyon. And then we also had to check out on the way back. Another major challenge to this evacuation was that I was also asked to take out a rare book collection and artwork that was in our library. No provision had been made for that evacuation of that location, and it doesn't fall under my purview. So tunnel vision, I was just thinking about my museum here. But what this meant for us was that I had to allocate 2 staff members who I had planned on using to evacuate museum collections and a vehicle and also packing material to the library so that we could evacuate that material there. So while on site at Estes Park, I was coordinating the evacuation of collections from the museum and the library instead of just focusing on the museum collection. Slide, please. So the museum staff members, Sarah and Katie, were waiting to help us unload at the Grizzly Museum. They had identified collections for us and places for our material, and they'd also made labels, like this one shown here, to clearly identify our collections. And over the course of the week, as you know, Sarah and Katie were checking our collections, they noticed that some of our artwork had got some ash particles and soot residue on them. So they kindly cleaned those off for us too. I will say that access to my collections while they were at Grizzly was never a problem. And the Grizzly staff were incredible hosts and made me welcome at all times. So I could go in and check on my collections and do some inventory of what we had evacuated, so I could keep those updated, those locations updated. Next slide, please. So back at the museum, we had got some fire lines built around the core of the camp. And the core of the camp includes most of our historic buildings in the museum. So here I'm showing some pictures of some trench lines, and then that big fire line in the middle of the slide, going behind some of our historic cabins, part of the museum complex right there. We also, a 1920s mountainside lodge that I showed you earlier in the presentation, they also had a fire crew stationed up there. They built some fire lines around that building and also created some defensible spaces. All of these buildings had been identified as values by buildings and grounds staff and also the firefighters. They positioned themselves around the core of the center to protect the historical buildings as well as our executive offices, you know, where things like our servers are stored. I will say that we have a great relationship with our local fire and police departments and also our county sheriff's office. They're very familiar with our site. We actually also housed firefighters and fire crews at both locations at Estes and out at Granby for many months as they fought the fires on both sides of the Continental Divide. And so with them being on site, they were also very familiar with where our property, you know, some of our property structures might be vulnerable. And so they were very cognizant too, because they'd gotten to know both sides. In addition, on our buildings and grounds crew, we also have volunteer firefighters. And so they actually worked alongside our fire departments to dig defensible spaces, cut down trees where needed, turn off the power to our over 200 cabins and lodges. And they also helped identify those key buildings. And I will say having those relationships are really important. Slide, please. So what went right? So despite the challenges, everything was evacuated according to the plan. Staff knew exactly where they needed to go and what they needed to do because of the training. They knew where the collections were located. And once we were allowed back on site, they just went into beast mode. They knew where everything was. They knew where all the supplies were. And so I didn't have to tell them what to do. They just jumped into action. Sydney and Colleen were just incredible. So what could we have done better? Well, we needed more packing supplies. And for some reason, I didn't have any work gloves in my packing supplies. And so having work gloves is really important. We didn't have the right type of vehicles identified to assist with evacuation. So we were using small compact cars like Priuses, and really what we needed were big cars like Expeditions or other big SUVs. But in reality, the vehicles that the Y Association own were being used to evacuate staff off property. So even if they had been identified in the plan, I wouldn't have been able to get to them. Having a snack bag of goodies for sustenance and water for staff, we didn't do that. We didn't think about how we were going to keep ourselves healthy and well. And so by the time we got to Grizzly, we were like starving because we hadn't had anything to eat and we'd been going full tilt. So that's something that maybe would be a good thing to have as a go bag. And also having a small first aid kit on hand. Didn't have that either. So that's really useful just because you're using boxes, you're moving paper, and so you're going to get cuts or scrapes on your hands. And so having a small first aid kit is really useful. What do we need to change? Well, in terms of the plan, I need to add the library collection to our evacuation list because I've been told that that needs to be on my plan. So that's something that I've got to look at. And then the other thing is we had too much stuff. Because of all those orange stickers, I evacuated everything. And it wasn't until I started opening boxes, it was like, why have we got this? Why is this a very important collection? So knowing your collections is really important, and something that, you know, takes time, but it's good to know your collection, and especially when you're thinking about your emergency plan. So what next? Well, we have to reevaluate. We have to reevaluate our threats. So next slide, please. So it wasn't until afterwards, when I had time to reflect on the plan, that when I looked at the historical data within our own archives, I realized that our proximity to wilderness, forests, creeks, and rivers had really impacted us considerably over the past 20 years or so, and enough of a frequent occurrence for it to not be a one-off rare event. And so it's something that I'm going to be considering when I think about our emergency plan and our risk assessment. So sort of historically, Snow Mountain Ranch, we were hit by the pine beetle infestation, like much of Colorado was, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in Graham County alone, which is where Granby is located, they lost more than 500,000 acres of tree to the pine beetle infestation. So along with the dead trees and drought, it's really increased our fire danger at the property. And in 2007, we had a 50-acre wildfire on property. And that's a picture there in the right-hand side. And that resulted in the association making the decision to clear cut and create defensible spaces around our property. And so those two photographs on the left-hand side give you an overview of how much forest we had originally at the property before 2007. So that aerial view on the top left compared to the aerial view on the bottom right, you can see that we removed a lot of forest. And this image on the bottom left is from 1974, just looking across our property, and it's just very wooded. It's just a lot of forestry there. So we had that fire in 2007 that was on property. And then in 2010, the Church Park fire burned just 5 miles south of Snow Mountain Ranch. And that actually also caused us to go into a pre-evacuation stage. So since 2010, we've clear cut 900 acres of dead forest and trees. We've also joined in a local community called Firewise Community, and that's a community of local residents and cities, and we're all working together to create defensible spaces around our personal and our municipal properties. We closely work with CSU's Extension and the National Forest Service on our forestry management plan. And we're also working with agencies at the moment to create a defensible space around the bottom of Snow Mountain or Sheep Mountain. In addition, we have a portable fire retardant foam truck, which is that vehicle you can see in the front of that fire there. And then in 2020, we had the Williams Fork fire and the East Troublesome fire, which resulted in mandatory evacuations for the town of Grand Lake and voluntary evacuation for Granby and Snow Mountain Ranch. So literally, we were surrounded by fires to the south, north, and to the west. Next slide, please. Estes Park. This is just an overview from 1976 to 2020. The town of Estes Park and the Estes Valley and the Estes Park Center has experienced evacuations due to fire. 2012, the Fern Lake fire in the Rocky Mountain National Park, and then the Troublesome fire in 2020. In 2012, we had a High Drive fire, which was down by the Beaver Meadows entrance to the Rocky Mountain National Park. And in fact, 23 homes were destroyed there and 600 people were evacuated. We also have had flooding occur as well. And in 2013, the valley was cut off from the Front Range because of the Big Thompson River flood. And so access to the center was only via Trail Ridge Road through the Rocky Mountain National Park. And then eventually Highway 7 was reopened via Lyons and Allens Park. But Highway 34, which is the main route out of Estes Park, along with 36, was closed completely and not reopened until 2018. So taking all that historical data, the threat of wildfire and flooding in our areas, to our centers at least, is increasing. And over time, over the last 20 years or so, we've actually experienced some kind of evacuation every 5 years or so across our association. So when we think about our assessments of each threat, we have our type 1, which is our catastrophic and rare, type 2, severe and sporadic, and type 3, mild and constant. I have to really think about where that wildfires and those floods come in, because they're catastrophic, but rare, they are not. It's something that's going to increase, and it's increasing, and I've seen it in my records over the last 20 years ago. So when I think about evaluating each of those threats, I'm going to have to look at those again. I'm going to have to reconsider and reevaluate my collections based on the historical data that I reviewed. And I have to think about maybe changing what those type 1 and type 2 threats are, because it's happening more often, and I really need to consider reconsider our risk assessment. Next slide, please. So thinking in those terms, I consulted with our buildings and grounds supervisors. I asked questions about possible spaces that I could utilize on camp at our centers. I asked about construction of buildings. I asked about fire suppressant systems. I asked about locations of pipes. I also asked about the locations of the buildings in relation to the environment, and also what the access was like. And so taking all those questions and consultations with the buildings and grounds, we did make the decision at Estes Park to move our archives out of the museum into a new building. And this is just some images there of us having moved that collection over. And so we're still in the recovery mode. And I still have some things to do in this new space, but at least for the time being, our paper archives, photographs are in a much better place. The building is kind of built underground a little bit, so in the basement, so three sides of the area are actually underground. It has a fire suppressant system down there. It has secure access both to the main building and to my collections space within that building. And one of the good things was when the power was turned off, this particular building kind of it's kept its temperature as much as possible. It didn't have dramatic changes. It was, you just very slowly temperature drop, and so so that was really useful. That's really helpful and to think about too. At Snow Mountain Ranch, the original, we went back into the original building. It was a modern building. It had defensible spaces. And so we just felt like that particular collection was the best place to be over at Snow Mountain Ranch. So we did move Estes Park and relocate that into another building, but Snow Mountain Ranch went back into its original location. Next slide, please. So before we could move back into the museum, we had to do some regrouping. The water could not be turned off at Estes Park because obviously it was needed for firefighting. So we did have some flooding in some of our buildings. Luckily, the museum was not one of them, but we did have some dramatic temperature changes. We evacuated the building, heating was turned off, and then about a couple of days later, we got dumped with a lot of snow. And so we had to, there was just dramatic temperature change within the museum, and one piece, the Victrola here that's shown here, received some damage. We had a lot of ash pollution and ash smoke in the museum, and so we had to do a lot of cleaning of the artifacts, and that probably took us a good week to remove all those damaging particles, and we had to air the museum out daily, and it took a good week to actually get the fire smell out of the building and create some circulation. Next slide, please. So climate change and the effects on our association are real, and from wildfires to floods to changes in weather patterns. For example, 3 years ago, the association had to purchase a snowmaking machine for Snow Mountain Ranch because we were not getting any snow in December. The timing of the arrival of the snow had changed dramatically over the last 15 years or so. So climate change has not only has an impact on our cultural, historical resources and our landscapes, but it's also impacting our operations and finances. Our insurance premiums for this year have gone up dramatically. From representing maybe 1.5% of our total budget to now representing anywhere between 3 and 5% of our budget. So that's a major increase to it for our insurance. I think looking back over the last year, we've been lucky. It could have so easily have been different. I had a community of friends as well as colleagues to which I could turn to for help. And I can't say enough about Sarah and her team. They gave me mental and physical support, and they let me know it was okay to feel helpless and overwhelmed and sad. Even when I knew that I had friends at Granby and who lived at Grand Lake who had lost their homes and their personal belongings. I felt very guilty for feeling this way about my museum collections, but Sarah was very gracious. Knowing that I could go and see my collections anytime I wanted to gave me a sense of purpose and a much needed distraction. I wasn't wallowing in self-pity. Sarah was also a great support too in other ways. We talked through what would moving back look like. What would I need to think about in terms of pros and cons of moving the paper archives and artwork into a new collection area? And then she also, her and Katie provided hands to help with the final move back. And we did this all under the strict guidelines of COVID, which was a feat in itself. One thing that I didn't consider in my initial plan, and Sarah made a good point when we were talking about this, was having, my initial plan was my staffing and using my staff. but I didn't have a backup plan in my emergency plan of who else could I call, who else could I ask for help. So my plan A really revolved around relying on local full-time staff to help, but all their homes were in danger, right? They were in danger too, and they needed to evacuate for their own safety as well. So maybe having a plan B of staff from out of town expecting that call to help would be useful. So that's where the community cooperation and healing comes in. And so as you consider your own collections, I do encourage you to think about the impact of climate change and how that's going to affect your abilities to preserve and protect your cultural and historical resources. But then it's going to think about sort of appraising your very important collections. What stories or memories are contained in them, and do they reflect the complexities and diversity of the community in which you work? What will be lost or left out if this was all you could save? And we're seeing that again in that fire over at Cape Town. A lot of oral histories have been lost, right? And so those stories have gone. So what else can you do to preserve and protect your history? So with that, I am going to pass you over to Bethany to talk about the Colorado Cultural and Historical Task Force, and that's going to really help you think about how we can work together as a community. So thank you.
So Karen, that was great. Thank you for sharing your experience. And as you may have noticed, Karen was talking about how important it is to make connections and to build your community and basically building an emergency network. So thinking about the people that you're going to connect with. And the number one thing I want to say is that you're not alone. Maybe you feel like you're alone, but you are not alone in making your emergency plan, figuring out things with your museum, figuring out things if there's an emergency. We are here. You can see that there's 3 board members of QAM. So I can say for a fact that QAM, we are here and we are ready to help in however we can. Next slide, please. So emergencies happen. They do. It's just a thing that happens. It can happen with any collection. It has probably happened with pretty much every collection at some point. Something has happened that's been unexpected. And a big part of it is, of course, at first recognizing your potential hazards, all those things. But then when you're executing your plan, you need to have your emergency network. And so you're looking, you can see I highlighted emergency network because people are very important as part of your emergency planning process, both in getting your collection ready and then also if there is an emergency, then responding to it. So you really want to get connected. And as Karen said, you want to look beyond probably just your local community. You want to expand outwards as well, because if your community, if several buildings, all the museums that you've connected with in town have an issue, you want to be able to connect outside then so you can always have support. Next slide, please. So when thinking about building your network, I'm going to touch more on each of these, but these are just some of the things to think about that maybe you haven't before. So maybe you only think that you can talk to museums, or maybe you just feel like you can only know a few people, but really there's an expansive network out there just waiting for you to tap into. Next slide, please. So first of all, look around your area, but also once again, beyond. But there may be networking groups that already exist in your area, such as the Northern Colorado Museums. They were having pretty regular meetups until COVID went down, but I'm sure that they will resume as soon as they are able. There's some other great associations like the San Luis Valley Museum Association. They're a very connected community. There's some other meetup groups like Drinking About Museums. There's emerging professionals. So take a look and see what's already in your area. You don't always need to recreate everything, like it might already exist there. Just, tap into your community. And if it's not there, then reach out to your local institutions and ensure contact information is shared. So for us, so I work at History Colorado, and we've been recently setting some meetups with some of the local institutions like the Denver Public Library, so we could get to know each other's staff and say hello. And This was all done digitally, which was great, but we now know some faces that we can reach out to. And it's not just about emergencies, it's about connecting and building a better community. And so set a meeting or two where set a meeting or where you can have 2 or more staffs get to know each other. I think we're all just looking to get connected and realize, we can help each other solve problems. And once again, it's not just emergencies. Next slide, please. So regarding emergencies and other issues, it's a really good idea to get to know your local emergency managers, first responders, and government officials. So for an emergency manager, you may not be aware of it, but most cities and towns, or maybe at the county level, you'll have an emergency manager. So you can just type in, like I can type in Denver emergency manager, and you can get the direct information of who that person is. And you can connect with them and say, hey, I just want you to know that my museum exists in your area. We'd like to connect with you. Like maybe we can, chat emergency plans or other things, but just make sure that you're on their radar. Same thing with your local police and fire departments. You also want to get to know your city council representative for your district, your mayor, etc. Get connected within your community. So for people like the police and fire department and maybe your emergency manager, maybe even your representative, your mayor, if you're able to, invite them to visit and get to know your site and its unique needs. This can be great for the fire department. When I personally gave a tour to our local fire department, they're like, now we know that we'd really like to save your building as opposed to like maybe the canned food site next door. Like ours, priceless, canned food could maybe be reproduced again and would be covered by insurance money, whereas the priceless artifact, not so much. So food can always, be a nice thing, maybe make some cookies, pie, something, once again, when you're able to have people back in your facility. And work with your responders on a response plan. Know who to call and to make sure they call you if something happens. So that's the good thing is if you create this relationship, they're like, hey, we saw somebody shady, like going around there. Do you want us to stop by? Or it looks like there's an issue or your wall has fallen down or something. Like they can get to let you know that. So create that relationship. And then especially for like your city council and your mayor, you can help them really become advocates for your site and collection. So if there is an emergency, maybe they can help you get more funding towards your site because they know that you exist and they will be invested and they care about it. And people love behind the scenes tours. It's just FYI. Next slide, please. So QAM, obviously, we're going to talk about how great we are. Networking opportunities throughout the year, at least we usually try to. We have had several workshops that happened this year. We had a few meetups, but we typically try to have meetups throughout the year in different parts of the 2 different states. So we're really trying to make a better connected network for all of us so we can get to know each other. And once again, so that then you know that you can reach out to somebody like Sarah, who's in Greeley in a different town, who might be somebody who can help you respond. There's also great benefits to being an institutional member of QAM, like you can get to learn how to advocate for yourself and reach out to your legislators and elected officials so you can get more of that funding to help with things like emergency preparedness or response to emergencies. You can access the environmental monitoring kit, which can help you figure out if your new storage space is actually going to be great for your collection or not. And you also get the membership in the purchasing co-op, which means that you get discounts on great things like supplies. You can apply for QAM grants, and you can also connect with our consulting services, things like getting emergency preparedness and peer preservation assessments. I think that those are on pause for now, but for the future. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, Sarah, Christina, and I are all part of the CHR task force. So we highly recommend that you sign up for the listserv. So this is a organization of volunteers. So it's volunteer, all of us who are involved. It's because we really care about our cultural institutions. So it is Colorado based. And I really think that Wyoming, you would benefit from setting up a similar structure. We can chat if anybody from Wyoming wants to reach out. But with signing up for the listserv, it's basically that then you can ask for help if you need it. And then also you can receive emails when museums are asking for help. So like Karen is sending out a plea for help. We need vehicles, we need supplies, we need people, we need help. Our museum is in danger. So signing up for the listserv, you don't have to do anything besides just sign up. You can just get the emails and never respond to a crisis if you don't want to, but at least you would know what's happening in your area. And it's really working on trying to improve our emergency response and our preparedness, and once again, getting connected. And one of the nice things about CHR is it's not just museum or library or other cultural institution professionals. It also includes someone who is with the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. So we've got some, connections there. So if you're having an issue, then you can reach out and contact us, or you can join the listserv and find out what's happening in your area and become more connected with your local institutions. Next slide, please. So as I said, in case of emergency, there is help. So whether you're in Colorado or Wyoming or beyond, you can also contact us. And that would be contacting our emergency chair, who currently is Christina. And you can get that contact information there and let us know that you're having an issue. And we will do all we can to sound the alarms and get it out to both the QAM members and also to the CHR task force. As mentioned, you can learn more about the task force through the website there, and you can sign up for the listserv. And I'm not sure if you want to say anything else about it. Christina, do you have anything that you want to say about CHR that I missed?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty good. And, backing up what you said about this isn't just people from our local institutions, it also includes representatives from FEMA, from the State Emergency Operations Office, that kind of thing. So it's a really well-networked group of people who can help you in an emergency.
Yeah, and as I've mentioned several times, you are not alone. Reach out to us. QAM, we're willing to help. We love our institutions, and so whatever we can do, get in touch. We'll see what we can do to help out. And Sarah's now going to talk more about how to actually put together your own plan, your own emergency response plan.
All right, thank you, Bethany. That was a wonderful emphasis on the importance of community connections. And now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the key components in emergency plans. So I think the panelists here have all done a great job of explaining that emergencies are unavoidable. They're going to happen. And the point of having a plan is not to avoid emergencies, but to become more familiar with our facilities, our collections, and our procedures so that we can avoid complete disasters. So one major component of planning is the pocket plan. So every pocket plan is customizable to your own institution, but there are basic components that are pretty common. So if you've never seen a pocket plan before, it's just a piece of paper. It's a two-sided document that's usually 8.5 by 14 size. And one of the key things you want on there is your staff list and your calling tree. So you put in order who you want to be calling whom if an emergency happens. You also want to make sure that you include what roles your staff are going to play during an emergency. So I saw in the chat, there was some conversation about making sure that mental health is taken care of, that you have food for your volunteers. You want to assign the role of who's going to be handling the collections, who's going to be speaking to public relations in your media. So have all of those conversations ahead of time. And even if you have a small staff, people can play multiple roles, but just make sure that that's decided and on your plan. Another section on your plan would be additional contacts, like your first responders, so your fire department, your police department, your Office of Emergency Management, and then information about your particular facilities. So your gas company, your elevator company, if you have a security system, put that all on your pocket plan so that you don't have to hunt for those numbers. And then you also want contacts that are specific to your collections. So if you have a conservator that you work with, or if you know that you can use a freezer truck if you have a water emergency, put all of those collections related numbers on your plan. And then you're going to have a section about collections in particular, about how to act if you have time to get back on site. So on the template for the pocket plan, they give you action steps that you can just leave on the template, that they're sort of like no-brainer steps that during an emergency, your brain might not be working at full capacity. So they walk you through, this is what I need to do an assessment. This is what I need to do to communicate out what our needs are to start the salvage efforts. Now, pocket plans are only helpful if you have it with you. And a lot of people might not want to be carrying around a piece of paper like this. So one thing you could do is have your staff save the document to their phone, or even just take a picture of both sides of the pocket plan and have it saved to their phone. So here is, it's hard to see, but this is an example of the template that you can download, and all of these resources are in a folder associated to our session. So you can download these yourself. But it's the same that I just mentioned. There's a section about your institutional contacts, your disaster team, your building utilities, your first responders, your calling tree, that sort of thing. And then on the back side of the template are those action steps to take during an emergency. And at the bottom, you can see there's a different section. Those are action steps that are all related to water emergencies. And that's because water emergencies are the most common. We've been talking a lot about fire, but with fire comes flooding, and then also just burst pipes if your sprinkler system goes off. So water is a huge threat to collection. So those steps are outlined for you right there. On your pocket plan, you'll also want to include key collections priorities. So ahead of time, identify which collections you would want to remove from which areas if you have the time. And as Karen pointed out, it's a good idea to go through your collections priorities and revisit them every few years to make what previous staff thought might have been priorities are in fact what you do want to be evacuating. So this is just an example of my institution's plan. Same idea, we just used some color to break up the sections. We customized it to our needs a little bit as well. At the far right column, we have a section about what to do during a medical emergency. And that's because we're a city museum, and so we are supposed to go to certain facilities if someone needs to go to the hospital. So you can sort of change and adapt yours. The backside of ours is mostly our calling tree because we have a lot of staff working in different areas. And then we also list our collections priorities based on which building they're located in. Okay, so the full plan. Again, it's going to be very customizable to your institution, but there are some major components that you want to include. One is to make it user-friendly. So put in an index, add tabs so that you can quickly flip to different sections. If your plan is so overwhelming that it becomes unusable, so don't make it that way. The majority of your plan might be broken out by emergency type. So that's a common way to organize plans, where you'd have a section on fire, a section on flooding, a section on maybe active shooter. And then, as Karen's been mentioning, the importance of external threats is really important to start thinking about in your emergency plan. So forest fires as opposed to an internal fire. So in those sections, you're going to want to outline what you'd like all of your staff to be doing, how to appropriately respond to that particular emergency. And you don't have to have all the answers. As Bethany mentioned, it's great to build up those relationships with your fire, police, and emergency management departments. Call them and ask them. They will help you decide what are the most appropriate steps for staff, depending on your facilities. Speaking of facilities, include as much information as is helpful in your plan so that people know, say, where the utility shutoffs are in your building, how to lower an elevator if the power goes out. You can use maps to show some of these things as well. And then you also want on your maps evacuation routes, and then you can put on your maps where your collections priorities are, where your collection salvage kits are. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then in your full plan, you have space to expand a bit on things that didn't fit on your pocket plan. So if you have more departments of within your organization, you can list more staff. You then have plenty of room to talk more about your collections priorities. So here you can list handling instructions. You can have pictures of where they're stored in your facilities so that people can quickly find them, because you don't have a ton of time. As Karen mentioned, I think she said she had 4 hours to go back on site to do her evacuation. you might want to think about having two versions of your plan, one with all of this sensitive information that key staff have that you give to your emergency support team, and then maybe one that's a little more widely distributed that might not have all of that information. So it really just depends on your needs and what you consider sensitive information. So I mentioned supplies. There are grants out there for you to purchase and have ready emergency kits. So you would want things like plastic sheeting, tape, trash bags, things to do assessments, so paper, pencil, cameras, and you put everything in hopefully a trash can with wheels so you can easily transport it around. If you have the resources to have additional items, fans are great to set aside. If you have a water emergency and you need to dry collections out, knowing where you have fans is wonderful. Having extra boxes that are broken down but ready for you to use if you need to evacuate collections. And then PPE. You want to make sure that the people who are coming back onto your site are safe. So definitely gloves and that sort of thing. Now, it's important to annually inventory your kits to make sure all of the supplies are there that you think are there. Check your batteries, make sure that your flashlights are working. Make sure your staff know that these supplies are really only for an emergency and they shouldn't be used throughout the rest of the year. And then if you do have an emergency and you use things, just make sure to replace things. We've talked a bit about the importance of practicing your emergency plan. May Day is a really helpful reminder. So it's this initiative to get everybody thinking in the month of May that it's time to do trainings. So we hold an all staff training in May. We get everybody together. We give them new pocket plans if we have new staff. We walk the grounds to make sure people know where to evacuate. We make sure people know where the emergency plans, the full plans, are located on our buildings. And then we invite the fire, police, and Office of Emergency Management, because again, we want to build up that good relationship with them so that they're familiar with our site, that they have the most recent version of our plans, and that Bethany mentioned, they love those visits. They love going behind the scenes and seeing all the cool collections that you have. So it's a really great way to start that relationship with them. Things to be doing year round, preventative measures like housekeeping. So you want to make sure the inside of your building is clean. Pests can create a disaster, so make sure you're up on your cleaning. Also just clutter. If you have to evacuate quickly and you have boxes everywhere in your walkways, that can be a real hazard. You want to make sure things are off the ground so that you don't have an even worse water emergency if you have a burst pipe or something like that. The outside grounds maintenance, clean your gutters, trim your limbs on your trees so that you don't have things falling on your roof, and then clearing out undergrowth so that you can just have a little less fuel for those forest fires. And then documenting everything that you're doing so that people know, oh, we always have a leak in that building, there's a storm coming, we should go check that building. You know, our HVAC system was just updated, so we're going to want to put new information into our plan. There was a question in the Q&A about how frequently to update your plan. As much as you can. Get into your plan as frequently as possible, because the more you save up updates for that magical day next month when you're going to sit down and do all your updates, it's never, you know, that one day where you're going to have all that time is not going to happen. So the more that you can be in your plan making quick updates, the better. So every time you have a new staff member, update your calling tree, collecting keys so that you have security of your site. If you change your security system, make sure that people know what those changes are and that it's documented in your emergency plan. And then, like I mentioned, just make sure that you're updating your emergency kit every time you use it and just doing a regular inventory once a year at least. So there are some resources that you can find after. You can download those templates for your pocket plan. There's nice step-by-step guides here. There's also resources for creating your full plan. And I'll admit, creating a full plan is intimidating, but start with your pocket plan. You've got the template, you can just plug in information, and then think about what sections you can expand a little bit. So you have, let's say, your calling tree. well, then jump over to your full plan and then include additional staff that couldn't fit on your pocket plan. Or you have your collections priorities on your pocket plan, then jump over to your full plan and fill out the information about how to handle certain collections or what needs special care. And then just keep working section by section. Also, the whole point of this session is about the importance of community building, right? So reach out to your regional museums, ask to have redacted versions of their full plan, and then you can see which sections are going to work for your building. You can maybe just copy and paste some sections too, if that's all right with people. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. And then we're all here for you too. So we're definitely here to help, and we would love to assist you in whatever way we can. So I think with that, I will kind of open it up for questions and comments, or if any panelists have anything else they want to jump in and mention.
I saw within the comment that Amanda had brought up that it's really good to have building into your policy support for like during and after, sorry, let me just read this. Building in some sort of policy that gives support during and after a disaster for your employees and volunteers. This can include looking at EAPs or incorporating mental health counseling into your plan. An analogy I always use is if the bees in the hive cannot do their basic functions, the hive will die. And I cannot stress employee well-being enough while developing your plan. I just thought that that was a really good and helpful comment. So I wanted to make sure in case people weren't checking the chat that they could hear it. So thank you for that, Amanda.
Yeah, because I'm part of a bigger organization, things like mental health support is already built in. As a museum, I'm at a department within a much larger organization. And so, but that's a really good point, especially for smaller museums, to think about how you can help your staff and make sure that there are resources there for them afterwards. Certainly, it's a very traumatic experience being evacuated from your property, and like I mentioned, we have staff that have lost their homes, and so so that mental health part is really important. And certainly my association that I work for has made sure that we've got those resources, and we've had those resources and continue to have those resources available to us.
I should mention that if anybody wants to request to join and have a conversation right now too, feel free to jump in and we can talk about any of the things we've been covering.
Put him on the spot, but I see Todd is in our audience. If he has anything you want to add about CHR, please feel free to join us.
Well, on a personal note, I just feel like hearing about your experience, Karen, was just really helpful to hear about all your plans and the ways that you were connected and what worked and didn't work, and how I'm glad that things ended up okay. That's wonderful. But yeah, just hearing about the whole process. I mean, there are just so many things to consider, and as Sarah said too, like that. With the fires, then come the floods after. And it's just these are things that are just getting bigger and more reoccurring and bigger. Just seeing all the broken branches around my neighborhood with the big storms. It just seems like, things are coming in bigger, stronger, heavier.
We're lucky that we have the buildings and grounds, and we work a lot with CSU and National Forest, and so they are able to keep on top of things. But yeah, I mean, we have to do that, like Sarah mentioned, doing that sort of grounds maintenance around our own properties. And so in the summer, we're always going through and clearing out that undergrowth, and calling others to come and chop down a branch or something because it's too close to the museum. And so yeah, it's an ongoing process when you're living so close to wild areas like we are up there. So
I have to imagine that that's interesting, since the area is, some of the joy of it is being amongst nature and being amongst the trees. And so I can imagine that some of the conversations to begin of, hey, we need to clear this to keep it safe, I could see that being difficult sometimes. Like, but the forest, we want it right here. And it's like, but we don't want it to destroy everything.
Yeah, and that was actually very true up at Snow Mountain Ranch, because I had gone to Snow Mountain Ranch when I first moved to Colorado 20 years ago, and I remember going down this road, and it's covered with trees, and it's just so beautiful, and sort of going back into nature. And then when I went back 2-3 years late, ago to get the job, I'm like, hey, this isn't how I remember it at all. I can't remember being here. Have I been here? And then I found out that we had cleared 900 acres of land, of forest. So it had changed the look and feel of the place dramatically. And I know there was some pushback when that decision was made, but ultimately, we have to protect our property and create those defensible spaces. I will say that flooding as a result of the Mountain Ranch and the forestry isn't an issue, because we are at altitude already, and a lot of our water comes from springs, so it's spring fed water from our own property, and so we haven't got that issue at Snow Mountain Ranch, but that is a big issue at Estes Park, because we're lower down, and there's things coming down from the flat top and the Continental Divide. So for sure, that's another location that we're going to have to think about, as well as water filtration and making sure the water stays clean and keeps running.
Well, it looks like we've reached our time. I definitely want to thank all the panelists, and especially Karen, obviously, for sharing your story with us. And we had up to 31 people in this session, and I think that's great. So hopefully everybody learned a lot. And do reach out to us. Our emails are available, and we can plug those into the chat real quick. But we would be happy to help you. And definitely reach out to CHR if you need help with emergency planning, or definitely if you are in some sort of emergency situation. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
This was fun. Thanks for having me be a part of it, guys.
Me too. Oh, thank you, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Robert.
Bye, everybody.